relatively prime. The definition of relatively prime. Let A and B be integers. Maybe we need to be careful that B is not 0. We'll worry about that later. We say, this is a definition, so we say A and B are relatively the GCD of A and B. This is the definition of relative. This is a hard one for beginners because the concept of prime is so embedded in their minds that they want to say like 7 is relatively prime. You can't say 7 is relatively prime. It's a relationship between two things. So you cannot say a single number is relatively prime. Give me some examples of numbers that are relatively prime. So these are pairs of numbers that are relatively prime. So 7 and 2. What's another one? 9 and 4. 9 and 4. Thank you, because people often think relatively prime, the numbers have to be prime. These numbers aren't prime, they're relatively prime to each other. Okay? What are numbers that are not relatively prime? 9 and 3 are not relatively prime. So I think if you understand this much, you understand the basic definition and the intuition behind it. Lots of things in cryptography rely on finding a pair of numbers that are relatively prime. And so we'll talk about that more later, potentially. But there's a really important function in cryptography. It's called the phi function or the totient function, and Euler is credited with it. So it's phi, Euler's, that is phi, right? There's phi function, also called the totient function. And so we're gonna restrict to positive numbers for this one, but let x be an integer such that x is greater than 0. Define phi of x be the number of positive integers that are relatively prime to x. And we just defined relatively prime. So what's phi of 1? I'm looking for the number of positive integers. Wait a minute, hold on. There's something really big that's missing. Otherwise, phi of 1 is going to be infinity. Less than or equal to x that are relatively prime to. You could, but I want phi of 1 to be equal to 1. I could ignore it, but it actually turns out that there's no reason to ignore it. You can just say, what about phi of 2? Okay, is 1 relatively prime to 2? Is 2 relatively prime to 2? Okay, so there's one number that is relatively prime to 2 that's less than or equal to 2. What about phi of 3? 1 is relatively prime to 3, you agree? 2 is relatively prime to 3, you agree? It is not relatively prime to 3, you agree? What about phi of 4? 1, 2, 3, and 4. What is 1 relatively prime to 4? Is 2 relatively prime to 4? Is 3 relatively prime to 4? Is 4 relatively prime to 4? What phi of 5? Remember what it means to be congruent modulo n? Let a and n be integers. N greater than 0. A, the phi of n is congruent to 1 odd n. That's lost.